In 2010, Caterpillar's rail division wrote a check for $820 million, plus about another $108 million in adjustments, and bought Electromotive Diesel. That is not a small company, and it is not an obscure one. Electromotive effectively created the American diesel locomotive. The machines that killed steam on this continent came out of its shops. If you have ever stood next to a freight train in the United States, you have stood next to its work. For most of the 20th century, the locomotive business in this country was effectively a two-horse race, and Electromotive was the horse that usually won. Its engines went into freight, passenger, and export service on every continent. The name carried the same weight in rail that Caterpillar carried in earth-moving. Caterpillar had already put around $2 billion into rail and transit since 2006. This was the centerpiece. For context on what that buys, $2 billion is roughly what a serious manufacturer spends to enter a heavy industrial category, and mean it. This was not a toe in the water. It was a decision, taken at board level, that Caterpillar was going to be a rail company as well as a construction company. Then the emissions rules changed, and across the entire era that followed, the American railroads bought from somebody else more than 1,000 times. A viewer asked for this story in the comments of this channel, and he asked for it in a way that suggested he already knew the ending. You could do a story on why railroads quit buying Cat locomotives, he wrote, did not want to spend the money for development of a bigger motor, so they took an existing motor and tried working it harder. They all failed. That is one man's account, and it is not a filing. But the outcome he is describing is documented, and the documentation comes from an unusual place. It comes from Caterpillar itself. Here is the part that makes this story different from every other version of the Caterpillar decline video. In September of 2023, Progress Rail, which is Caterpillar's rail arm, filed an antitrust lawsuit against Wabtec, and inside that complaint, Caterpillar's own lawyers wrote down the market position of the company beating them. Wabtec, the complaint said, supplies approximately 75% of the active diesel long-haul freight locomotives in North America, and approximately 90% of new long-haul freight locomotives complying with the latest Tier 4 emissions standards. 90% of the new ones, written by Caterpillar, about its competitor, in a federal filing. That is an unusual document to have. Companies do not normally publish their own defeat in numbers. It exists because to argue that a competitor holds monopoly power, you first have to establish, on the record, exactly how much of the market that competitor holds. Caterpillar's legal strategy required its lawyers to write down the scale of its product failure. Put a number on what that means in units. Since Tier 4 took effect in 2015, roughly 1,200 new long-haul freight locomotives have been built in North America. More than 1,000 of them were Wabtec. Caterpillar bought the company that invented the American diesel locomotive and then took something in the region of 200 units out of the following decade. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what Tier 4 actually did to this business, because it was not a small regulatory adjustment. Before we go further, if you run the iron or turn the wrenches on it, subscribe and turn on the bell. Tier 4 emissions standards forced a fundamental redesign of the locomotive prime mover. Cutting nitrogen oxides and particulates to the required levels meant new combustion strategies, new aftertreatment, new cooling, new electronics, and a very large amount of validation on an engine that has to run for decades in freight service. Every manufacturer faced the same wall at the same time. It was, in the most literal sense, a development race with a fixed deadline set by law. That is exactly the kind of race a company with a 7-year horizon wins and a company with a 90-day horizon loses. And the timing is the cruel part. Caterpillar bought Electromotive in 2010. Tier 4 arrived in 2015. The company had roughly 5 years, inside a business it had just purchased and did not build, to fund a clean sheet engine program for a market that buys a few hundred units a year. A few hundred units a year is a rounding error next to Caterpillar's construction business. It is also a category where the development cost does not scale down. That is the trap in one line. The engineering bill for a Tier 4 compliant prime mover is roughly the same whether you sell 300 units or 3,000. Wabtec could spread it across a dominant installed base. Caterpillar had to spread it across a division that had just cost nearly $1 billion and had never earned back a cent of it. You can see how that meeting goes without having been in the room. There is another detail in this story that operators will recognize immediately, because it is the same detail that shows up in every other one. The locomotives are still designed in LaGrange, Illinois. The engineering did not leave. The people who know how to build an American freight locomotive are still, right now, in Illinois, doing that work. What changed was not the engineering. It was how long anybody upstairs was prepared to wait for the next one, and how much they were prepared to spend on a market that would never move the consolidated number. There is a specific kind of damage that does to an engineering organization, and it is not that people become worse at their jobs. It is that the ambitious programs stop being proposed, because everybody has learned which proposals get funded. The engineers do not need to be told twice. And when the product did not win, the response came from the department that had been winning all along. Progress Rail did not answer Wabtec with a locomotive. It answered with a lawsuit, alleging that Wabtec had abused its market power in mainline diesel locomotives, equipment, and services. The case settled out of court, reported in February of 2026. The audience of this channel has a phrase for that sequence, and they use it constantly. When engineers are not making the decisions, and financiers and accountants are, you get a McDonnell-Douglas situation. 7 separate people have reached for the Boeing comparison in these comment sections, across 5 different videos, without anybody prompting them. They reached for it because they have watched this exact shape before, and they are not reaching for it loosely. The Boeing comparison is precise here, in a way it usually is not. A company with unmatched engineering heritage, in a duopoly, facing a hard technical transition on a regulatory deadline, choosing the derivative path over the clean sheet, because the clean sheet could not be justified inside the planning horizon. That is the pattern, and this audience has seen it land on their own suppliers. Now, in fairness, this is not a story where Caterpillar has been driven out of the business, and anybody telling you that is overselling it. Progress Rail is still building locomotives and still winning orders. When Canadian Pacific Kansas City placed a recent order for 135 units, it split the order. 65 Electromotive SD70 ACET, 4 locomotives from Progress Rail, 70 Wabtec units. That is a real order and a real product. Caterpillar also supplied battery electric locomotives to Union Pacific for what was described at the time as the world's largest battery electric locomotive fleet. The company is in the market. It is simply in it as the second name, in a category it paid nearly $1 billion to lead. Being the second name in a duopoly is a survivable position and a profitable one. It is just an expensive place to arrive when you bought the first name to get there. There is one more thing in the numbers that is worth saying plainly, because it changes how you read the whole decade. The North American locomotive market is small now, and it has been shrinking. Order volumes are a fraction of where they sat in 2015, when the market was worth more than 2 billion euros a year. Since Tier 4 came in, only about 1,200 units in total have been built across the entire continent, by everybody. So this is not a story about a booming market that Caterpillar missed. It is a story about a shrinking, brutally technical market that rewarded whoever had already done the engineering, and punished whoever had to start. Which is the whole point. A shrinking technical market is precisely where patient capital wins and quarterly capital loses, because the return on a clean sheet engine program in a market that buys 300 units a year does not arrive inside any reporting period anybody is measured on. Wabtec, for its part, was not being noble. It was defending an installed base worth defending, which is the easiest capital allocation decision in the world to justify. The asymmetry was never about courage. It was about which company already had the volume to make the maths work. Wabtec did the work. Caterpillar bought a nameplate, and then had to justify the development spend to a board looking at construction margins. And here is why any of this matters to somebody who will never buy a locomotive. The rail business is the clearest available test case of what happens when this company meets a category that demands a long horizon. There is no dealer network story here, no software lockout, no argument about repair access, just a hard engineering deadline, set by law, with years of warning, in a business the company had just paid nearly $1 billion to enter. It lost that category to a competitor whose market share it eventually had to write down in its own court filing. The next time somebody tells you the compact track loader numbers prove Caterpillar is fine, both things are true at once. Caterpillar wins the categories with a short payback and loses the ones with a long one, and it loses them to whoever was allowed to keep spending when the spending looked unjustifiable. Subscribe if you want more of these. This channel covers the real story behind the machines, the part the dealer never puts in the brochure. The commenter who asked for this story had it roughly right and one layer short. The problem was never that somebody worked an existing motor too hard. The problem was who decided that working an existing motor was the cheaper option, and what he was being measured on when he decided it.